the obvious question I have is, what prompted you to write the book?
Well, actually, I have to admit that it was not my idea to write the book. Pelican Publishing Company came to me in early 2015 and just kind of out of the blue said, would you be interested in writing a book about Tom Benson? This was just shortly after the litigation. All the lawsuits had started flying among family members when Tom had a big blow up with his family, and they began suing him. Later, he would countersue. And it was a very public and very bitter and ugly situation in the family for such a high-profile person. Here's the owner of the New Orleans Saints and the New Orleans Pelicans, the NBA team here. And all of a sudden, the public is seeing just a lot of dirty laundry there among the family, with a real battle shaping up over his estate. All of this was happening at the time that Pelican Publishing contacted me. And of course, that all of the litigation made it a very dramatic situation. It had the makings of a good story. And we realized also that no one before had told the complete story of Tom Benson's life. He'd been written about in news articles, of course, after he bought the Saints and over the years of his ownership of the Saints. But his whole story had never really been told in a complete way. And so I jumped at the chance to do this. And I spent nearly 2 years researching and writing the book. And I wanted to tell the most complete story possible. I approached it as a journalist, which I've been for most of my life. Sure. And, I wanted to be fair to everybody, but I wanted to tell, as I said, a complete story. And I really feel that I succeeded in doing that. I feel very good about the story, about the book. And I think that people who know who Benson was, but didn't know a lot of details about his life, I think they'll find it fascinating, because that's what I'm hearing from people is they just had no idea there was so much drama and there was so much that went on in his life that was really interesting. Now, I should say, obviously, the primary reason you and I are talking about this today is because Mr. Benson passed away last week at the age of 90 years old. And so the sports teams are ostensibly passing on to his third wife, Gail, and that's the way he wrote his last will. So, and the Saints and the Pelicans have assured everyone that is what is happening. So that's where we are with it. And that's how I came to write the book. And now, of course, there's a great deal more interest because people really do want to know, who was this man?
So what has been the response from the family?
You mean to the book?
Yeah, to the book.
I haven't heard any direct response. I have heard indirectly some things. I should point out that this was an unauthorized biography, and that's what Pelican Publishing and I agreed from the beginning. That's the type of book that I would write. What that means is that I did not seek the permission or the approval of Mr. Benson to write the book. Now, I did seek interviews with him and all of his family members, and all throughout the process of writing the book, I kept that door open and made sure that they had opportunities to comment if they wanted to. I was not at all surprised when I first extended the request for interviews. Their lawyers would not let them talk, and because of the litigation that was going on. And I assumed, frankly, that that's what would happen when I undertook the writing of the book, because usually attorneys in that situation don't want their clients talking publicly. And so I was not surprised by that. So I put the book together using many, many other interviews with other family members, more distant family members, a lot of associates of Mr. Benson over the years, people he worked with, people who filed suits against him or maybe were on the other side of a litigation with him. And I did a great deal of public records research. And so that's how it was put together. The only thing, kind of indirect response I've heard since the book came out is that one of the reporters, a local reporter, wrote a review of my book and talked about it at some length. And he told me later that he had contacted the Saints to ask whether they had any comment or whether Mr. Benson would wish to comment about either the book or the article. And they just gave him a no comment. So, again, not surprising at all.
Sure. The litigation definitely would have an impact, I would think.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So we do have a question and comment actually from Marshall Barber. Benson seems to have been a really good person. The anti-Jerry Jones. What do you think about that? I mean, there's two parts of that. A really good person.
Hi to Marshall Barber. I do know Marshall. That's kind of funny that and I know that he's not here in Louisiana. But I don't know that I would call Benson the anti-Jerry Jones. Benson was a real different guy. He was a real different person, particularly in the NFL. And given that when he first joined the sort of elite club of NFL owners back in 1985, when he bought the team, he easily could have been seen as a fish out of water. Tom Benson was a very plain-spoken guy. He was not a person you would associate with the glitz and glamour of the NFL. So it seemed kind of an odd fit at the time. And I think some people inside the league probably did think that he was a little bit of a fish out of water. However, the league really came to respect him in a lot of different ways, primarily for his financial acumen, his really strong business sense. He had an extraordinary business mind and an extraordinary talent for making money. And that's what he did all his life. And they really respected that. The other owners saw, once he got into the league, they saw the kinds of deals that he was achieving with the state of Louisiana through the governor's office, the legislature, the deals for leasing the Superdome. And he just got these extraordinarily favorable terms on his leases for the Superdome and for the concessions and whatnot. And it was really kind of amazing. And I think the other owners came to respect him a great deal. They put him on one of their most powerful committees, the finance committee of the NFL. And he served on that committee for 20 years, more than 20 years. And he chaired the committee. He had 3 terms as chairman. So he was highly respected for his financial sense in the league. And he became one of them for sure.
You know, I'm wondering, where did he get this incredible mind for business? I did an interview just on Friday with Jim Miller, who was the executive vice president of the Saints, and you know, we talked about this, and from what I could tell, I mean, you know, Jim said it was just his passion. Well, I've got a lot of passion, I don't have that kind of money. So I mean, what was it? I mean, obviously he must have been really super in terms of math, but he was also just a very good business person.
I think he just had an inherently good, strong business mind from an early time. He did go to he spent several years at Loyola University, and he majored in finance. He didn't actually graduate from Loyola. He left school and he got married. I think he was anxious to get on with it and make money, but he just had a talent for making money. And some people do, you know, it's just, you can go to school and have a degree in finance and not necessarily have the kinds of skills that Tom Benson had. And he was a real deal maker. He was one of those guys who really understood how to succeed in making deals and how to always be on the right side. I talked to many different people for the book who told me, you know, don't ever get on the other side of a deal with Tom Benson because it won't end well for you, probably. And that's kind of how he was seen. He was a very tough businessman, a very tough deal maker. I talked, among other people, I talked with Edwin Edwards, who was governor of Louisiana at the time that Tom Benson bought the Saints. And he worked closely with Benson and with the legislature to try to get the deal done. And of course, talking with Edwin Edwards was a trip in itself. It was fun. But he made that point. He said, you know, Tom got what he wanted. He always got what he wanted. And at one point in the negotiations over the leasing terms, before Benson actually said, okay, I'm going to do it, I'll buy the Saints, Edwards had run into a snag with the legislature. And some of the lawmakers had said, well, we like this and this and this, but there's this one thing that we're not happy about. Can you get him to change his mind? And Edwards told me, he said, well, I didn't see it as any big deal. I was sure that I could get Tom to do that. So I went back to Tom and told him that, you know, if you'll just concede on this one little point, they're ready to go. And he said, Tom Benson said, no way. He said, if I give in on that, they'll want something else. you go back and you tell him that Tom Benson is on the 10-yard line. It was a fun story, and he actually did that. He said he went back to the legislators and said, Tom Benson's ready to make the goal, and he's gonna do it, or he's not going to do it, So he got his way, and that was often the case in any kind of deal.
Right. I've heard some similar to that, actually from Jim Miller, and who basically said that they were in negotiation with Edwards, and Benson was yelling and screaming and all that, and Edwards basically said, hey, you've already won. So we have a comment, at least we have remarks from Annie Lustow and Nancy Cowan. Hello, Kathy Finn, and Annie is listening. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead and ask the questions. If you have a comment, go ahead. Also, go ahead and share. You can share now. You can share after it's over. If you watch the video after it's live, you can share the recorded video too. So we'd love for as many people to be able to see this and to know about your book. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to put up, if you don't mind, I'm going to, you're not going to be able to see this, but
okay.
Everybody else will. And so I just put up the picture slide that you had sent to me, and this is when it looks like the four were going to courthouse. Rita Benson.
Right.
Any background to that picture, or yes. Other than it was just a horrible situation.
It was that was a real low point in this whole dispute with the family. That picture was taken outside of the Civil District Courthouse in New Orleans, and it was when Tom's daughter Renee, who was in that photo, along with her two children, Rita LeBlanc and Ryan LeBlanc, and the other person in that photo is their attorney, Randy Smith.
Right.
And they were on their way into the courthouse, and they stopped to talk with reporters outside. This is when they had filed suit seeking to have Mr. Benson declared mentally incompetent and unsuited to handle his own affairs. And because he had cut them off, essentially, and written a very public letter saying that he wanted nothing further to do with them. And the upshot of that was that they tried to have him declared incompetent. So that, of course, wound its way through the courts and then finally went to trial. And that particular photo was taken while the trial was going on. They were on their way into the courthouse. This was, the trial was closed to reporters. We never, many of us were outside the courtroom for much of the time during the trial to try to glean what was going on inside, but it was closed. They had sealed the records. Once the suit was filed, they sealed the records, and they kept all the proceedings out of sight. So it was a very difficult time. Mr. Benson was having a lot of trouble at that point. He'd had a leg surgery. He was using a walker to get in and out of the courtroom with his lawyer. And you may remember some of the comments. At one point, TV reporters interviewed him as he was coming out of the courtroom, and he said, having your family turn against you is for the birds, is how he put it.
The birds.
It was a low point for him. It was a terrible time. And I'm sure it was hard for the family members too. We as reporters didn't get an opportunity to really view what was going on inside that courtroom. But it was a very dramatic time.
Any idea what precipitated it? Was it concern that Gail would be getting the money and the team, and was that it? And by the way, I just put up Gail's picture, so she's now live on the screen. But was that? Yeah,
it's fair to say that the whole dispute erupted because of friction between Gail and primarily Renee, Tom's daughter, and the grandchildren as well. I should point out that Tom has a third grandchild who was not involved in this suit at all, and who in fact separated herself from what her cousins were doing. And she, to this day, she remains very close remained very close to Tom up until the day of his death, I should say. But yeah, what happened was essentially friction with the third wife, Gail Bird, who had been married to Tom at that point for about 12, 13 years. And Tom's daughter never liked Gail. They never got along from day one. Now, in fairness to Gail, I have to say that according to my interviews, Tom's second wife, both of his first two wives died, and so he was twice widowed before he married Gail. And I understand from the family of his second wife, Grace, that Grace didn't get along well with the family either, and there was a lot of friction. So I think it tended to be just that Tom's daughter didn't like anyone who seemed to be coming between him and his daughter. And I guess at some point it just became too much for Tom, and Gail was the one, his wife was the one who was with him 24 hours a day and was really taking care of him as he got older and older. And I think it just came down to the point where Tom made a choice and said he wasn't going to deal with the family anymore. So it was a heartbreaking time for him.
Do you have any idea as to whether or not the family has gotten together? I mean,
you mean after the litigation, you mean?
Yeah. Are they now any closer?
I don't think so. I don't think so, Stephen. I don't know for sure, but I don't think so. I think that, we saw that Gail is the one that we've heard from the most since Tom died several days ago. The Saints have made clear, the Saints and Pelicans have made clear that Gail is the person who now is in charge and who holds the ownership of these teams. Now, of course, that's been very complicated because part of the litigation that went on was not only the lawsuit over Tom's mental state, but there were separate lawsuits filed over the ownership of those sports teams, which of course were his greatest assets.
Right.
He has had an estimated net worth of somewhere close to $3 billion.
Right.
Much of that was the Saints. So one of the things that happened during that litigation was Tom sought to get back. He had put some passive shares, non-voting shares of both of those teams into the hands of his heirs through trusts that he had set up. And there was a provision in the trust that if he ever wanted to take assets out of those trusts, he could do it as long as he replaced those assets with things of equal value, cash or other things. And so that's what he sought to do after he split with his family. He rewrote his will, leaving everything to Gail, everything that had not already been parceled out to the family, which amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars already.
Right.
And so he sought to get all of those shares back in his hands so that he could leave 100% of those teams to Gail. My understanding is that the litigation, that portion of the litigation was settled about a year ago, but the terms were never disclosed publicly. My understanding is, though, that they set up a mechanism by which Tom or his estate would buy out those shares from the heirs so that they would have Tom and Gail would have them all back in her hands. I think that's still going on. I don't think that's been completed, but I do know that the NFL and the NBA both approved of that settlement. So they signed off on it. Mm-hmm. To my knowledge, it's going forward, and we don't have any reason to believe that it won't go forward. I think it probably cost Tom hundreds of millions of dollars more to do that. And I think he borrowed money. I think the Saints borrowed money from the NFL in part to cover that. And that's not unusual. The teams have a lot of ability. Those owners have a lot of ability to borrow great sums of money from the NFL, and many have done it. So it's not an unusual thing to do.
We have a question here. Annie Lusto, hope I'm saying it right, has posted, Tom Benson was both a hard businessman and a generous public citizen, which was prominent your
That's a good question. That's a very good question, actually, because I think up until about 10 years ago, let's say, I think Tom was really seen by anybody who worked with him or dealt with him. He was seen as one of the most hard-nosed business people you could ever come across. I mean, in my book, I go into detail about a number of deals, a number of things that went on, unrelated to the sports teams. You know, you go back to the car dealerships where he made his initial fortune, and some of the things that he did, and the kinds of behavior you saw there. I mean, he was brutally tough in business. I don't think that's an exaggeration at all. He knew how to make money. He knew what he wanted, and he just always insisted on getting his way. And it kind of didn't matter who was standing in the way. And we see instances of I have a story in my book, one of the stories in my book about, you know, he got his start in the automobile business from a guy named Mike Persia, who owned dealerships in San Antonio and in New Orleans. And Mike really taught him the business and helped set him up in business so that he could buy his first dealership. So he really gave Tom his start in a business that became a very lucrative one for him. Yet about 20 years after that occurred, Tom had the opportunity to help Mike's grandson in a similar fashion, and he refused to do it. In fact, he really left the grandson out in the cold. It's one of those brutal Tom Benson stories, and it's not the only one. So he had a very tough reputation. He was relentless in business, and always in deal making. He was extremely tough. I think his image softened. You remember, of course, after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and the terrible trauma that hit the New Orleans Saints at that time. Sure. I mean, the Superdome was wrecked. They couldn't play the games in the dome. Tom was in a position no NFL owner had ever faced before, where he could not field his team on his home court, his home field. And so he moved the team immediately over to San Antonio, and he had to do something, and it was not surprising that he would go to San Antonio because he'd had business relationships there for many years, and they kind of borrowed the Alamo Dome for a little while. They played some of their games in LSU Stadium in Baton Rouge. He put the season together. He salvaged the season for the Saints, and it would have been awful. It could have disrupted the whole NFL schedule if one team just couldn't play its games that year. So it was a lot of pressure, but the real controversy in New Orleans began when rumors began to seep back to New Orleans from San Antonio, saying that Tom fully intended to move the team out of the city, out of New Orleans permanently. Right. And the rumors were very believable. I interviewed a lot of people for my book who were involved in meetings at the time with NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue. And there's no question. I mean, the Saints and Mr. Benson's associates to this day would say that Tom never intended to permanently move that team out of New Orleans. But I can tell you that I interviewed people who say otherwise and who were involved in those meetings. And it's pretty clear that were it not for Paul Tagliabue, who stepped in and said, "You're not taking that team out of New Orleans," the team probably would have been gone. And so Tagliabue was really the one who put his foot down about it. And Tom Benson did not like it at all, but he got over it, particularly after they put enough money, the NFL and other sources and the state government put enough taxpayer money behind fixing the Superdome and whatnot, putting new luxury suites in it and that sort of thing, which would bring him more revenue. Right. He calmed down and he recommitted to New Orleans.
Of course,
but he had an image problem to overcome. And I think that's when his charitable giving really stepped up.
Right.
And I think a lot of that had to do with Gail. I think his wife, Gail, recognized that he had a public relations problem. And she was more sensitive to it than probably Tom was. And so what you saw is in 2007, they set up the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation and really began putting a lot more money to work around the city. You see it in Oxnard Hospital, Oxnard Foundation
Right.
Medical Center, Loyola University, Tulane University, many schools, the Catholic Church. Tom had always been generous with the Catholic Church, but this was stepped up after 2007, 2008. And then, of course, the Saints winning the Super Bowl went a long way toward rehabilitating Tom's image. And so you saw, the city softened toward him after all of that. And I think toward the end of his life, people had a much different impression of him than they had earlier.
Sure. I mean, we know I guess the disagreement, that's probably putting it lightly, between Tom Benson and Arnie Fielkow. And interestingly, Arnie went on to become the councilman and then the president of the council, and then president CEO of the National Basketball Retired Players Association, now Jewish Federation.
Right. Yeah, Arnie Fielkow was the I believe he was executive vice president of administration at the time of Katrina, and he was a person who really kind of stood up to Tom Benson when Benson was looking at moving the Saints out, and he was pretty vocal about it, and apparently it cost him his job. I mean, Tom fired Arnie. And I tried to talk with Arnie actually for my book, and he would not comment. It's possible that he signed a non-disclosure agreement with the Saints at the time. I don't know that.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah, it definitely cost him his job. And as you mentioned, Arnie then went into politics and ran for city council. And he won a seat, an at-large seat on the city council. And I really think that a lot of that came about because people really felt strongly that he had done the right thing with the Saints, or tried to do the right thing with the Saints, and that it had cost him something. So I think that probably won him some votes.
I've got to put this up, and please forgive me. By the way, I've had on the screen, I've had a picture of Benson holding up the Lombardi trophy.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I mean, that obviously was such a incredible moment. The picture has, I think, Drew Brees in the background.
Yes. It was an incredible moment.
Yeah.
And all of those photos, by the way, are in my book. And that particular photo, I think, is in the first chapter, because when I sat down to write the book and tried to figure out where to start, I knew that I didn't want to write a linear biography where you just say, well, Tom Benson was born in 1927 and da-da-da. And so I said, well, I'm going to start it with the Super Bowl of 2010. And so I did. I said it. The first chapter is in Sun Life Stadium in Miami, with Benson surrounded by all of his family, and of course they were playing the Indianapolis Colts, and I kind of drew a contrast between Benson and the owner of the Colts, Jim Irsay, who was a very, very different sort of person than Tom Benson. And I just thought, that was a good way to set it up. And I kind of ended the scene, at least that one scene in the chapter, saying, could this have been the happiest moment in Tom Benson's life? And, looking back at it, of course, that was 2010. So, we're almost 8 years, we're 8 years away from that now.
Well, I think I have the happiest moment. I just put a tweet up. I'm sorry you can't see it, but everybody else can. And it says, this is from Will. I imagine the first thing Tom Benson said to Jesus this afternoon was, did you know the Falcons blew a 25-point lead in the Super Bowl?
That's a good one.
Yeah. Absolutely. I just had to put that one up. Let me see. I think we have one more comment. Bear with me. I'm trying to multitask.
Okay.
We did an interview recently with Arnie Fielkow.
I haven't seen Arnie since he's been back in town. I need to connect with him.
Yeah. I'll send you the link to the video that we did. We did with Alan Mason. So, pardon me. So, in terms of your book, let's talk about it for a second. Tom Benson, A Billionaire's Journey. What do you think? Here's the last question I have, and that is, I mean, other than the fact to say that people can get your book at Amazon's, am I correct?
Yes, it's available around New Orleans. It's in all the bookstores in New Orleans, I think. You can certainly get it at Barnes & Noble, Garden District Bookstore, Octavia Books, lots of others. You can get it on Amazon, all the major websites, Amazon, Target, Walmart, I don't know how. And you can download the e-version of it as well. So it's available in all those formats.
Great.
Yeah, and you can get, if you really want an autographed copy, you can go to my website, kathyfinn.com, and I have a place there where you can order the book directly from me, and I will autograph it for. Some of those stores do have autographed copies. Occasionally, I stop in and sign some books for them. So, if for people in New Orleans, you may still be able to find one.
Absolutely. And in fact, we'll put a link on. We're going to take this interview and we're going to transcribe it and put up different segments along with the video, and we'll put a link to your website, kathyfinn.com. So the name of the book, Tom Benson, A Billionaire's Journey, and I guess the very last question I have is, if based upon your information, what is the key moment that actually, I guess, put him on that journey to be a billionaire?
Well, actually, that's pretty easy. And that's the moment that he actually bought the New Orleans Saints. I like to tell people that Tom Benson was a self-made man in terms of the wealth that he amassed through his automobile dealerships, because that was strictly Tom. That was Tom creating his own business, building his business through buying and new dealerships and building new dealerships and buying land for those and all of that. And he made probably a few $100 million by doing all of that in the first 20 years or so of his career. But he became a billionaire, I always say, on the backs of the NFL and the taxpayers of Louisiana. Because I like to tell people, if there's one lesson you want to take away from my book, here it is. If you ever get an opportunity to buy an NFL team, you want to jump on that.
Yeah.
Because you will make money hand over fist. And I think Tom knew that. I think people ask me sometimes what prompted him to buy a football team. And I say, well, it's not a love of football.
Right. And
by his own admission, he didn't know anything about football. What he did understand was that you can make a lot of money owning a major sports team. And he saw that, and he saw those opportunities, and he became a billionaire, as many owners do, through their ownership of these big teams. So it worked for him. He was right.
And he was just a partner when he bought the team with a number of different people who sold their interests out. So
he bought the Saints for $72 million in 1985, and only a fraction of that money actually came from him. He always had controlling interest in the team.
Right.
He set it up that way, but he had maybe almost 24 individuals
right.
who contributed shares and maybe owned 1% or a little bit more than that of the team, up to 10%. And so, but as soon as he had the team in hand, he set about getting rid of those other investors, so to speak. He found ways to get them out of the deal, buy them out, so that he became the sole owner of the Saints. And that's what he had in mind all along. So again, it's part of his deal-making skills. He knew what he was going to do. He saw it. People say Tom Benson had the ability to see around a corner. And I really think that's kind of true. He saw things, he saw opportunities before other people saw them. And he knew what to do and how to lay out his game plan. And that's what he did. And he was very, very successful at it.
An amazing man, really, just a real loss to the city, a loss to the state.
It is
But
a
I'm really
loss.
glad that I've had this opportunity to talk to you to get a really good perspective from the business side and the personal side. I always have enjoyed your writing, whether it's the Reuters or in the past city business, and really
I
appreciate
appreciate that,
you
Steve.
taking